Greetings and welcome to the Modern Alchemist channel. I'm Aubrey Forrest, the Modern Alchemist, and this is Essentials of Practical Alchemy 2017, The Science of Magic. Today on Essentials of Practical Alchemy, we are going to address an issue of esoteric illiteracy, something that I have observed that takes place both within the field of the esoteric and most certainly outside of the field of the esoteric, meaning all the rest of you guys who've never ever talked about anything that you hear us talking about on this channel. This particular class is going to be of great worth to you because you will be able to learn to distinguish the difference between a symbol, a sign, and a token. These are three esoteric or occult instruments which are used to convey a meaning. And they are not literary devices, which they are often confused with, like metaphors and similes. So join me as we explore the wonderful and amazing world of alchemy as a language expressed in symbols, signs, and tokens. I'm Aubrey Forrest, the Modern Alchemist. Let's begin.
Shall we begin? Let's begin now.
Alright, so today's class we are going to talk about symbols, signs, and tokens. My experience has been, especially through the course of learning this material and then teaching it later, years later, that the vast majority of people out there have no idea what the difference is between a symbol, sign, and token, or a metaphor, or a simile. And all of these are treated as interchangeable or exchangeable. All of them are treated as having, being a part or a component of the same paradigm, the same process of thinking, the same application of language as an instrument of expression. And everyone who thinks all that is absolutely wrong. So this course is going to be really useful for anyone who's had even the slightest exposure to any kind of ritual or ceremony, like a wedding or a baptism. This material will be very useful for anyone on the outside of some of these communities looking in and trying to understand what they're doing. Because a lot of the confusion that people have, a lot of the misunderstanding is simply the result of just not knowing. It is in fact a kind of illiteracy just as significant as if you didn't understand how to read colloquial English or whatever language you might be speaking in whatever country you might be in. Because the language of symbols and signs and tokens is a language which, when you are exposed to it, you are able to communicate volumes of information with the smallest of actions or expressions. So what is the difference then? What is the difference between symbols, signs, and tokens and a metaphor or a simile? Well, first off, a metaphor, to define it, a metaphor is a turn of phrase or saying or figure of speech wherein one thing is substituted for another or places an image in your mind. For instance, the reason I'm teaching this material is so that we're all on the same page. The idea of us all being on the same page is a metaphor. We're obviously not sitting on a page and we've not been transcribed to a page. And the understanding of what that page is, or its significance, is reminiscent of another class that I've talked about, wherein having an understanding of the narrative, the social narrative, then becomes expletive to understanding what this metaphor might be, like being on the same page, right? A simile is similar, and there's the key. The idea of simile and similar is connotative of it being like something else or as something else. So my heart swelled like a great hot air balloon with all the warmth that I am feeling inside. That's an example of a simile. His anger burned within him like a roaring fire. There's an example of a simile and a metaphor combined. Fires don't roar necessarily, lions roar. So to say the fire roared is a metaphor. To say his anger burned within him like a roaring fire is a simile incorporating a metaphor. All right? So there's the linguistic side of it. And the reason why I say linguistic is because lingua is a language. It speaks to language, what is spoken. Symbols, signs, and tokens are not part of that paradigm. They are not part of that spectrum. And this reveals the encoding then that is foundational within the entire system. And that is that to understand that a metaphor or a simile is linguistic and therefore spoken, lingua, the tongue, and to understand that a symbol or sign or token is seen and not spoken, but they're seen or witnessed or experienced, but not spoken nor heard, then you see the two pillars. Because on the metaphor and simile side, we have Saturn, which rules Binah, which is the pillar of severity, and Saturn itself rules speech and hearing. Okay? On the other side, we have the pillar of mercy, and all of that is ruled by sight. And it aligns itself to the current agent pro tem, which is in charge of the system, the Lord, which is the sun. The sun and everything associated with the sun is a component of vision. So on the right, with metaphors and similes, we have a feminine receptive expression, which is spoken or heard, and on the left, we have a masculine projective expression or instrument, which is seen or felt. All right? So now that we kind of see where those pair off and the fact that they are, in fact, mutually, they're separate, but as you have seen, you can embed one within the other as a descriptive of yet another thing, just as I did in the expression of his anger burned within him like a roaring fire. That is a complex series of referential descriptives. And in the same light, when you want to see a complex series of referential descriptives and they're symbolic, one need only look at a piece of statuary and of course meditate upon that, meaning look at it and decipher what it is that you are seeing. And so that you know, that is the purpose of a meditation, is to see ultimately what it is, and then therefore to understand, because by seeing you can see the entirety of it in an instant, just like a snapshot. Whereas on the other side, it has to be described to you. So do you see the difference? Do you see the utility? Perhaps one of the easiest ways to teach a person about the esoteric is to refer to the ritual of marriage. All of us, in one way or another, have either participated in a marriage, witnessed a marriage, read about a marriage, have been married or are currently married, and have married people probably somewhere, either in our workplace, in our family, or in our home. So talking about marriage is probably the most human thing that we can talk about. What's amazing about marriage is that it facilitates itself as an excellent example of symbols, signs, and tokens in operation as a principle of universal operations. And the Kabbalah, which is, of course, a language describing operations which are universal. So, here we are. Let's talk about marriage and see what symbols, signs, and tokens we can discover as a process of looking at the ritual of a wedding. The first thing that comes to mind, of course, is that there are certain players involved in the wedding. There is the bride, and the bride, from our perspective, is always on the left hand of the groom, and there's a reason for this. Now, out of curiosity, I went ahead and I wanted to see what secularly and ordinarily people describe as the reasons for why the bride is on the apparent left of the groom. Thus far, I haven't found anyone who refers to anything that I'm about to describe to you. Specifically, that this is a representation of Kabbalah in operation. What do I mean by that? Well, the bride is typically clad in white, and the groom, if he's wearing a tux, and he's not in the military, or a part of a particular unit wherein he then is representing that unit as a component of his identity or his function. Okay, if it's just a regular guy, then he's probably wearing a black tux. So what's going on? Oh, and then of course we have a couple other players here that are of great importance. We have the officiator. And the one member that always seems to get overlooked, at least in terms of just evaluating what is going on an esoteric or any other level, is the father. The father has one job. I know because I've done this. The father has one job, and that is to present his daughter to the groom. That's it. That's the job. What's going on when the dad does that? So the father presents the bride. He brings the bride to the groom. And then this is essentially all the essential players. Of course, there are the best men and the bridesmaids. And we could go on and on about a discussion of the origins of those components as well. It's nice to think that all of those are probably the result of some kind of tribal, secular, whatever. But in truth, we can always learn something about the universe and the Kabbalah by studying the process of a wedding. So, what is the deal between, I put tux down, and the tux is black, right? So, that's funny. So what is the deal between the bride being in white and the groom being in black, but still retaining their positions relative to Kabbalah? Because if we were to just simply take the tree of life and go, whoop, we would have the top of the Kabbalah. This is Keter, then this is Chokmah, and this is Binah, right? So it literally, and of course then the officiator fulfills the role of father, this is son, and this is the spirit. And we can keep going and going about this. This also, because of the relationship of the sun relative to the Kabbalah, because Chokmah up here does not actually have a specific planetary influence. So the sun can stand in as agent pro tem, meaning the guy in charge for now, in place of cosmic influence. And when you understand the complete narrative and where the sun figures into that, it makes absolute sense. So the sun is both at the center, but it's also the thing that starts it. Relative to what's going on here, then, we have a retelling of our own journey in the cosmos as a process of wedding. And this journey is, in my mind, as I've studied it, this is not unique to human beings. This is the way things are done in the universe, from the standpoint of atoms all the way up to solar systems and galaxies, and who knows, and beyond, right? But the system is always scalable, and it's always fractal from top to bottom. Okay, so what's going on up here? Well, why is the bride wearing white and why is the groom wearing black? There are multiple reasons for this, and to unpack them all would take a lot of time. I'm going to only give you a couple, okay? Because the symbolic relevance of a person donning the vestment of another person who characteristically resides in a particular function is an aspect, in fact, of synchronistic union. Now remember, I said during the eclipse we were going to talk about synchronism, and synchronism will be a topic that will be coming up shortly and in the future Essentials of Practical Alchemy. But for right now, synchronism is when two things align to form a singular thing. You can think of it as two lenses, okay, and then aligning. Each star representing an eye, right, just like I am an eye. So as they align, and one is in front of the other, or one is aligned with the other, a new aperture, a new opening, a new portal is created. Well, when these two are in each other's vestment, and they are in the process of aligning, this exchange then is completed during the consummation of the marriage, when after the covenant making is done and after the tokens are exchanged, the wedding is consummated, and at that point your vestment is dropped to the ground, right? And you present simply as you are. So the man is masculine projective and the woman is feminine receptive, and they incorporate that dynamic into then their nuptial relationship, right? Where they become one. The identity of each switching here, right, and being represented by the other's color but still sitting upon the appropriate side of the pillar they represent, is a foreshadowing of their unity, that oneness. Quite literally, he is within her skin and she is within his, and by adopting that color, so that together then they become, as is the admonition, one flesh, right? One person, one complete entity, because you're two sides. You are the counterpoint to the other person's soul. You are the dualistic opposite that is forever unified through the contract of your covenant and marriage. So these then are all incorporated in that. But before we get to that, let's look at the process of what brings us up to the altar of marriage. Okay, so the father has just one job, and that job is to escort his daughter, the bride, up to the groom. So what's taking place here? What is it that we are seeing? Because there is a universal process in operation here. Well, the process is this, that a masculine projective source is moving through the cosmos, which is part of that the carpet or whatever it is that they happen to prepare for the father and the daughter to walk up. Each of the people in the audience then representing stars, since the I, the self, is a portal or gateway through which the universe communicates. And as we have understood from previous classes about the Eye of Horus, then our presentation as an I is an exemplar of the universal emanation. So when they're walking up, this universe is then represented, the cosmos, by all the eyes in the audience, which are stars, which are people, which are witnesses to this exchange. What is the exchange? A stellar body has in its outer shell, in the negative receptive area, a potential body that is receptive and free to transit from one body to another. Just as what you see with two atoms that are reconciling their valence between each other in the electron shell, where they might exchange an electron between them, or two or three or whatever happens to be the case in creating that molecule, so too the Father is taking his electron, his negatively charged receptive body, to another stronger, positively charged receptive body, which will capture it and pull it into its orbit and then protect it. So this is symbolically what's going on here. And there's so much employed in a wedding that's just absolutely beautiful and amazing. It's why people who are trained in the esoteric can get all weepy when they're watching a wedding take place, because they're not just seeing the wedding of two people, two beautiful young or old or whatever people that happen to be there. They're witnessing something that is a universal exchange or property that goes on and on forever from top to bottom. So the officiator then fulfills the role, Kabbalistically, of Keter, which places him in the role of father. And it's interesting because really the officiator's role then is simply to stand there and to witness, to be the point by which everyone is alerted, right? Hey, this is what's going on. And then to conduct the covenants that take place between the bride and the groom. And this is where you get to see this amazing kundalini take place within the process of a wedding. Because we'll move from Saturn back to the sun, and then Saturn back to the sun like a needle threading two garments together and making it one. By this I mean that the process begins with the solar process. Well, actually it begins with the Saturnian process. Before the father and the bride have entry, there is music which announces that they're coming, da, 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 right? And da, 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 da. And then dad walks down with the bride, and this goes from a visual thing or an auditory thing where you're alerted and you have an auditory cue. The auditory cue falls under Saturn, which rules speech and hearing, to a visual cue where you actually see the father and the bride walking down the aisle, okay? This then concludes with the reception of the bride to the groom, and she assumes her station over here to his left, which would be on the right relative to the officiator who's standing there, right? So if she's on his right, she's on the groom's left, but the moment that they turn around, they join the officiator in proper posture. See? It's just really, really cool. But anyway, so at which point the officiator then, bring us back to Saturn, announces what's going on, and usually says, hey, if there's anyone who's got an issue with this, please identify now or forever hold your peace, which then is first initiated if no one's there, because they're just looking. So everyone's looking, no one's saying anything, and in silence, everyone looks around nervously to make sure everything's okay. If someone wants to do something, they have to stand up, which is then a visual cue and an invitation for them to be acknowledged by the officiator. So he's seeing you and he acknowledges you by speaking, and then the other person responds by speaking and saying, this is my objection. All right? If that doesn't happen, then it goes back, because we've gone to the visual side, then it goes back to the auditory side where he begins to conduct the covenants. So then the officiator goes back into the officiator's custody, wherein he then initiates the performance of the covenants. And the covenants then are a sign that this wedding is taking place. It's a sign, not a symbol, to everyone out there. When the covenants are concluded, then a token of those covenants is exchanged, which is symbolic of their having entered into them and symbolic of the duration of those covenants. And typically that has to do with a wedding band. The reason most people choose a golden band as opposed to another mineral is because the covenants are exchanged under the agent pro tem, the Lord God, the golden star in the heavens. And therefore a gold is its element and is indicative of our current state of consciousness. Okay, so there we are. We have now a basic understanding of the difference between metaphors and similes and symbols, signs, and tokens. And we've been able to see these differences expressed by looking at something that we all know and have seen or participated in or are aware of, specifically a wedding. And we've been able to show the symbolism behind the wedding, the signs the wedding represents, and the tokens which are exchanged as a process of two people being wed, and relate those to the esoteric principles that they embody. That's symbols, signs, and tokens. And this is Essentials of Practical Alchemy. I'm Aubrey Force, the Modern Alchemist. I'll be talking to you soon.